Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 23 playthrough of the Pittsburgh Pirates. We are at the beginning of the 2047 offseason with the Pirates. We just had the best season we've ever had with the Pirates, 162 record, won the NL Central by 9.5 games, and earned home field advantage for as long as we were alive in the playoffs. And we ended up making it to Game 6 of the World Series, where we fell to the Red Sox 4-2. So this was the first World Series trip for the Pirates in our decade as general manager of the team. So from that perspective, have made pretty good progress. We're now 26 seasons into this playthrough between the Royals and the Pirates. The Royals, we made the playoffs 12 out of 16 seasons, so 75% of the time. And we've actually made the playoffs 8 out of 10 years with the Pirates, 80% of the time. So could argue that we're doing better with the Pirates than we did with the Royals. The big issue, though, is that we won those 5 world championships with the Kansas City Royals. And we are yet to win a championship here with the Pirates. But it was a good year. You can see we've got a full 10-year history now of our time with the Pirates. As we talked about, made the playoffs 8 out of 10 years, 7 in a row. You can see the last 5 years we've been kind of a 94 to 100 win team pretty consistently. But we're going to be losing some big players this offseason, most notably our ace, Luis Longoria, and likely former number 1 overall pick, Henry Gonzalez, in the outfield. So we're going to have some holes to fill next year. Probably not going to be quite as good as we were this past season. Taking a look at the accounting, had a $65 million profit for 2047 with the long run through the playoffs and steadily increasing ticket prices and maintaining pretty good fan interest throughout the season. So that was very positive. Despite the $65 million in profits, though, as you can probably see if you're looking closely here, there's really not a need for me to go to my email, although that's what I'm trying to do. But we got a $10 million bump in our budget. So owner Robert Nutting has pocketed most of the big profit that we made last season. 55 of the 65 million profit went to him, but we did get a $10 million bump in our budget to 174 million. So a little bit of progress there, I guess. We're going from 164 to 174, the highest budget that we've ever had. Player payroll right now is a little bit elevated, simply because there are players like Henry Gonzalez who we're probably going to move on from, and then we're also going to have some difficult decisions with a couple of relievers, notably Ethan Mingo, who's looking to make around $7.5 million, and Mike Wright, who's going to be making a little more than $7 million in arbitration. Both of those guys have been good pitchers and good contributors for us. Just don't know that we can be affording around $15 million for a couple of guys who will likely be middle relievers for us. Yoshitaro Nakahara, who had a nice year for us, is also due for a big bump in arbitration after we signed him to a 1-year deal as a free agent. Given that he's older and wrecked physically, he's going to be a tough guy for us to bring back as well. But before we start getting into the decisions around all of our players, we'll take a quick look back at the key contributors to the best season that we've had here with the Pirates. And the Pirates last season were a very talented and well-balanced team, finished second in the National League in runs allowed and second in the National League in runs scored. So obviously those are the type of performances on the field that are going to add up to a 100-win season and the best record in baseball. Pitching staff was very strong and stable. Luis Longoria is headed to free agency. We probably have to let him go. He is a fragile pitcher who's now almost 30 years old that through pitch counts we have kept really healthy for the last several years, gone at least 32 starts, each of the last 5 years. And we've gotten a good performance out of him. His ERA actually ballooned to 4.07, the highest of his career this past year, the first time he's ever been higher than 3.72. And he's also just looking for a ton of money, $26.5 million a year over 7 years through his mid to late 30s for a fragile pitcher. Just not a contract that I think that the Pirates can afford to give him. So we're going to give him a qualifying offer and likely move on and thank him for a nice close to a decade in terms of helping our starting rotation and helping us consistently be a playoff team. Sean Street is a guy who we traded for a couple years ago. Really had a nice year. First-time All-Star, 17-7 record with a 3.90 ERA, 204 strikeouts. Lefty is going to be an important part of our rotation going forward, although he's going to be looking for around $10 million in arbitration, so he's starting to get expensive as well. Bobby Gonzalez, left-hander who has been with us since the second season of this playthrough back in 2039. You can see he's never started fewer than 29 games for us, but it does appear that he is trending in a not-so-great direction in his late 30s, went from 17 wins, a 3.07 ERA, and a 2.52 BABIP to an ERA of close to 4 with a 2.90 BABIP, and this past season a 4.53 ERA and a 3.44 BABIP. Clearly there's a chance that some of that is bad luck, but there's also a chance that as he gets close to being 38 years old, his stuff is just not as good as it used to be, and he's going to get hit a little harder. He's looking for around $9 million a year for 4 years. I think it's probably time to move on from him. So we'll have Street back at the top of our rotation, and then a couple of younger players. Alex Arroyo, who had a really nice rookie year, 13-12 record with a 3.65 ERA, 199 strikeouts. Great personality for the former 13th overall pick in baseball. And Sal Valadez, who is a guy who we picked in the second round of our first draft in 2038, has been a starter for us the last few years now, went 13-9 with a 4.14 ERA this year. So we will likely have Street, Arroyo, and Valadez back in the rotation, but potentially moving on from Longoria and Gonzalez are going to give us big shoes to fill with a couple of 12-game winners who have been with us 9 years in the case of Gonzalez and 7 years in the case of Longoria. Moving on to the bullpen, we picked up Jose Calderon in a trade with Houston. He was okay with us, 3.75 ERA over 24 innings pitched, did strike out 32. Was the losing pitcher in Game 6 against the Red Sox as we puked a 3-run lead in the 9th inning. So that was not an optimal finish to his career with us. He's going to be looking for a lot of money this offseason. We'll be moving on from him. Devin Smith is a rookie who should slot in as a third or fourth starter. Presumably Street and Arroyo will be 1 and 2. Valadez and Devin Smith will be 3 and 4. This is a guy who was a 6th-round draft pick a few years ago out of Rhode Island, number 37 prospect in baseball. Went 7-5, spent a little more than half the year in Indianapolis this year with a 3.27 ERA, and came up as a reliever for us, where he put up a 1.50 ERA with 42 strikeouts over 30 innings. Finesse pitcher who doesn't throw all that hard, but certainly has a nice 3-pitch arsenal. Think he will slot right into the rotation next year to help fill the gaps caused by the departures of Longoria and Gonzalez. Greg Gaylord is a guy who's been a pretty productive reliever for us over the years. Doesn't blow people away with his stuff, movement, and control, but a good curve, good fastball. Iron Man goes out there every day. Lost his closing job to Calderon, which, as we talked about, cost us in the playoffs. Is what it is at this point. 2-time All-Star, reliever of the year in 2044. And after putting up a 1.49 ERA with 88 strikeouts, 72 2/3 innings pitched this year, probably will get a few votes for reliever of the year this year as well. He'll be back. Juan Bin Daoud hit a 3.16 ERA for us out of the bullpen. Bobby Astorga, 3.36 ERA out of the bullpen. Both of these guys are really two-pitch guys, Bin Daoud and Astorga. Although Astorga actually is more of a four-pitch guy, it's just that the second, third, and fourth pitches aren't that great. So Astorga could start for us as a fifth starter if he had to. Bin Daoud probably better in the pen. And then Danny Robles was 3-1 with a 3.16 ERA as a lefty specialist. Those guys will all be back next year. The decisions we have, as we talked about, are Ethan Mingo, the right-hander, 3-1 with a 3.68 ERA, and Mike Wright, the left-hander, 6-2 with a 2.83 ERA. Both guys looking for $7.5 million a year. They both can start if they need to. Wright, again, profiles as maybe a fifth starter, and honestly, Ethan Mingo, similarly, probably a fifth starter in a pinch. So you could argue that we bring them back for continuity's sake, because if we do move on from those guys, particularly the left-hander, Mike Wright, we're going to be moving on from Calderon, a lefty, and we're going to be moving on from Gonzalez, a starting lefty. So that does make Wright in particular someone we may want to bring back. Just have a hard time justifying $7.5 million for relief pitchers that aren't exceptional, but maybe it'll be a little more palatable if I think that we're slotting one or both of them in as a fifth starter, or maybe even a fourth starter if we have some injuries. But the rotation and the bullpen probably not going to be quite as good as they were this past year, given that we're going to be losing a couple of starters and at least one, possibly more relievers. The big decisions we have to make, as I talk about, are Mingo and Wright, and what we want to do with those arbitration-eligible players whose contracts are starting to get a bit pricey. Turning to our offense, which was much better this past season, we made a trade for catcher Andres Coronel, and the Iron Man had a nice year for us. We've got the Cubs to retain a good chunk of his contract, 40% of it, but he is going to start getting expensive the next few years. But he really helped stabilize the position defensively and was at least a productive offensive player with a .279 batting average, 21 doubles, 11 home runs, drove in 60 runs, a bit above average in terms of his OPS plus and his WRC plus, added up to a 2.5 WAR for us as catcher. Chris Rodriguez was not great as a backup, a negative WAR this season, hit just 200 and 140 at-bats, but still profiles with a solid defensive ability and a good personality as a decent backup catcher for us. David Green got a lot less playing time this past year after leading the National League with 48 doubles in his first full season in 2046. Only had 134 at-bats this year as a utility infielder, hitting .239 for us. The addition of Lupe Zelaya to really stabilize that first base position for us was a big part of the reason why Green got a lot less playing time. Zelaya did everything we could have hoped, hit .289, 37 homers, 107 runs batted in. He is a guy that the Phillies are retaining half of his contract. That said, it's still going to be around $13 million for us starting the 2049 season. So a guy who could price himself out of Pittsburgh down the line. Right now, just enjoying having him as a big left-handed bat in our offense. Julio Castillo, the rookie, number 21 prospect in baseball, former international free agent signing from 6 years ago, should be a Rookie of the Year candidate. Hit .261, 28 homers, 119 runs driven in. Played an acceptable defensive second base for us. Nice addition to the team. Jaden Dixon, backup, split the year between AAA and the majors, is a veteran utility infielder. Bobby Guzman is a guy we'll be moving on from most likely. Looking for pretty big money in free agency at this point, and he's been kind of a part-time third base / second baseman for us the last couple years. Did hit .294 this past season with 25 doubles, but no home runs, not a ton of power there. Probably time to move on from Mr. Guzman. In part of the reason we'll be able to move on from Guzman is that Jerry Rivera is coming, 24-year-old, hit only had 232 at-bats with us and hit just 203, but he has hit 348 and 301 in parts of the last 2 years at the AAA level, so not much for him left to prove in the minor leagues. Certainly profiles as a potential third baseman for us who could play some other positions in the infield or outfield in a pinch. So feel pretty good that potentially we'll have Rivera at third, Castillo at second, and Lupe Zelaya at first next year. Shortstop, we've got Luis Linares, who we picked up in a trade with the Cubs. They retained the vast majority of his contract. So kind of viewing our former starting shortstop, who was a pretty regular starter for us this year, is a super utility guy for us the next few years with his great defense. Going to probably let Juan Castillo continue to play short. He had a bit of a sophomore slump in his second year with the Pirates this year. Batting average dipped to 245 from 282. Home runs got cut in half to 12 from 24. But still profiles as a useful offensive player with a decent glove. Would prefer a better defensive shortstop than Castillo in a perfect world. But think that he does bring a much better bat than Linares at this point. And with Julio Castillo at second, Zelaya at first, and Guzman at third next year, shortstop is kind of where Juan Castillo slots in if we're going to play him every day. He is the best of Rivera and the other Castillo in terms of his defense, which is why he'd end up at short, but is definitely not an optimal defensive shortstop for us, although he's certainly respectable there. Turn into the outfield, we'll have Joel Fields back next year. This is a guy who has not hit incredibly the last couple years in the majors, just a $179 and 84 at-bats. But he did hit 346 and 350 at-bats in AAA this year with 28 home runs. So nothing left for him to prove there. Think that he could be a fourth outfielder, corner outfielder for us next year, has a good personality. And he'll probably be getting some of Henry Gonzalez at-bats next year. Gonzalez, former number 1 overall pick for us in our first year running these Pirates. And unfortunately, he just hasn't developed into as good a major league hitter as we would like. He kind of lost a regular starting job this year, had just 288 at-bats, 10 homers, hit just 229. Issue with him is that he is going to be looking for over $11 million in arbitration. And for a fourth or fifth outfielder, as much as we've invested a lot in him as a former number 1 overall pick, I think it may be time to see what we can get for him in trade. So while I wouldn't mind keeping Gonzalez around as a fourth or fifth outfielder, particularly with that left-handed bat, probably not a financial decision that the Pirates can make. Another tough financial decision is going to be Yoshitaro Nakahara. Picked him up as a free agent for only $2.6 million for the now 34-year-old out of Japan. He played brilliantly for us, 264 batting average and 28 home runs in 360 at-bats. Did have several stints on the injured list. He's wrecked physically, and as I mentioned, almost 34 years old. He's been in the majors for 4 years now, so he's arbitration eligible at $6.6 million. It's a tougher call for me at 6.6 for him than 11 for Gonzalez, because Nakahara is clearly a better hitter at this point in his career, but don't love the fact that he's in his mid-30s and he's wrecked physically. So that's going to be another decision that we're going to need to make in the near term. Arturo Arellano is another arbitration-eligible player that we will definitely be bringing back. Former Rule 5 guy who's become our starting center fielder. 261 average this year with 44 doubles, 29 homers, 83 runs scored, drove in 97. Pretty solid player defensively. Very important for us to have him back. Danny Calez will be back next year, the 25-year-old former third-round pick. Took a lot of that playing time from Gonzalez this year, hit 250 with 25 home runs and 336 at-bats, like that left-handed bat, and think that he probably slots in as a full-time left fielder for us next year, most likely, because we'll be having Alex Racho back in right field, former number one draft choice for us, fourth overall in 2039. Hit 275 with 42 doubles, 15 homers this year. He's been a little more productive than Henry Gonzalez over the last couple of years. His arbitration number is not getting quite as extreme, but I think it's going to be around $4 million. A little over $4 million this coming year. So he is a much more cost-effective version of Henry Gonzalez for us next year. So looking at this team, feel like we've got Calez in left, Arellano in center, Ruacho in right next year. Joel Fields is a backup corner outfielder, which gives us the ability to potentially move on from both Gonzalez and possibly Nakahara in the offseason. So as we think about arbitration and free agency, not going to re-sign Jaden Dixon, utility infielder. Jose Calderon, looking for $18 million a year for 4 years. Certainly not an amount that we can spend on a closer. Talked about Bobby Gonzalez and Bobby Guzman. Time to move on from both of them, as well as Luis Longoria, looking for around $26.5 million a year. We are going to put out a qualifying offer to Longoria. Hopefully we'll get some draft pick compensation back for him, but given that he's fragile physically, feel like we've gotten the best years of his career for the most reasonable financial parameters out of him at this point. In looking at our arbitration-eligible players, going to make offers to Street, Valadez, Bin Daoud, Robles among the pitchers, Arellano and Ruacho among the outfielders. As we talked about, got to decide what to do with Mingo and right. Going to move on from 4A catcher Mario Quiroz. Likely going to move on from Gonzalez, and probably going to move on from Nakahara, given the amount of money that those guys are looking for, and lack of production in terms of Gonzalez, and just age and injury proneness in terms of Nakahara. And thinking about what we want to do with the potential arbitration eligible pitchers, Mingo and Wright, taking a look at the top pitchers who could be free agents this year, particularly when we're thinking about lefties, Jose Calderon and Bobby Gonzalez. So two of our guys are the top lefties out there. So definitely could be weaker next year. Victor Rojas, also a lefty out there, but looking for about $13.5 million. Latrell Young is a little bit intriguing. He's a 31-year-old lefty who supposedly is only going to be looking for about $2 million. Certainly profiles is a useful arm for the bullpen, and he is a little better against lefties than he is against righties, which you would hope. So he is a player who we could pick up potentially if he does end up hitting free agency. But other than that, there's not a lot of left-handed talent out there as far as the pitchers. And even the right-handed talent that's out there is either pretty expensive in terms of the money that they're looking for, or in the cases of a lot of these players, guys in their early to mid-30s who just probably aren't going to be a big improvement from what we have with the likes of Mingo and Wright on our team. So definitely have some decisions to make on that front. Taking a look at the top potential everyday players who are going to be out there. A lot of guys who are going to be looking for a lot more money than we can probably afford, and not necessarily a ton of difference makers either. Danny Carrio is probably the best potential upcoming free agent third baseman. Certainly would not mind having that bat with a decent glove at third base. but he's looking for close to $30 million a year. So I think that we're going to continue to go with the bit of a youth movement at third and probably give Rivera the first chance to earn the job full time next year. So I think the first thing we're going to do with the players that we're unsure of how to proceed in terms of arbitration is to shop Henry Gonzalez. Just can't see us spending around $11 million for a fourth or fifth outfielder, even though he's a player that we've been trying to build around for the full decade, basically, that we've been GM of this team. Rookie of the Year, two-time All-Star, MVP of 2 playoff series for us. But he's not an $11 million a year player, and he's only going to get more expensive. So I think we want to see what we can pick up in the trade market for Mr. Gonzalez. I can't imagine it's going to be a huge amount, given that his arbitration number is pretty high. But if we can get back even just a decent reliever, that could allow us to make it a little easier potentially to move on from Mingo and or Wright. And there is a long list of decent, mainly relievers that we could get for Gonzalez. No one that's particularly exciting or a difference maker, really kind of guys who would be a fifth starter or a, fourth or fifth arm out of the bullpen. So nothing too exciting. We may do a player search just to see if there's a pitcher out there that we like a little bit more and see if maybe we can piece something together centered around Gonzalez for a guy that's a little better than the players that people are willing to offer for us straight up for him. And probably not surprisingly, it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to use Gonzalez in any real blockbuster kind of trade. So it's going to be addition by subtraction to get his $11 million plus salary off of our team. Got a deal pieced together here with the Blue Jays. We're going to get second baseman Mario De Leon. He is a utility infielder. You can see he can play a competent second, third, or short. He can hit enough to hold on to a major league roster spot. Hit 288 and 251 the last 2 years in parts of seasons with Toronto. Would view him as a pure utility infielder, and he does have one option year left. So he's a guy who could help the back end of our roster next year, and we can stash him in AAA if we need. And we're also going to bring in a familiar face with Willie Arenales, left-handed reliever. He is a back of the bullpen left-handed type of arm at this point, although he was an all-star in 2040 with us on the Pirates. He's a guy that we moved on from as he started making more money, but you can see came up with the Pirates, had him for 5 years. He's making decent money now for a middle reliever at a little over $3 million, 3.2 and 3.4 million for the next 2 seasons. But we can get the Blue Jays to hold on to 35% of that contract, make him a little more palatable for us. And Arenales actually still has an option year left also, although presumably he might not. He might protest against that, being a pretty well-established major league reliever at this point. But does give us a little bit of insurance with a left-handed arm out of the bullpen. I'm going to see if maybe if we throw in a prospect who's not all that great, we can get them to keep a little more money. It looks like that's possible, so we may do that also. No guarantees that either of these guys makes our major league team next year, but in the case of De Leon, we could definitely stash him in AAA. Arenales, he's a left-handed arm. That's about the nicest thing I can say about him at this point. And if we add in a couple of middling prospects, Hector Alvarado and David Ford, we can get them to keep 65% of Arenales' contract. So that puts us on the hook for a little over $1 million each of the next 2 seasons, which for a respectable left-handed arm is not the worst thing. So We are going to go ahead and move on from Henry Gonzalez. Fans not pleased, which is, I guess, a little surprising given that he hasn't performed all that well for us, but definitely took a bump in the negative direction to fan interest. While we're thinking about it, we're going to lower prices just a bit heading into the offseason. We should have a few of these arbitration eligible players that we're going to re-sign, which hopefully some of them will boost fan interest. But clearly, moving on from the likes of Calderon, Longoria, Guzman, and Gonzalez, going to be taking some hits when our free agents move on from us as well, in terms of our fan interest. And given that Nakahara is wrecked physically, going to be in his mid-30s, $6.5 million seems like a lot. We love the fact we got him on the deal this year and we nursed him through a healthy season for us. But with the likes of Kelez and Fields in the outfield, feel like we've got younger, healthier options that are also cheaper. May end up regretting moving on from him, but I think we are going to trade him for Jesus Inamagua. Reliever, 25-year-old from the Phillies organization. He's got 2 option years left, kind of a back of the bullpen kind of arm, but as I mentioned, does have 2 option years left, does have a decent personality. Probably not a player who's going to play a big role for us, but somebody who could help us on the margin, potentially. And we can also get $3.6 million in addition to Inamagua if we move on from Nakahara. He was just such a productive hitter for us. And I do feel like we do have a spot still in the outfield. That there's a part of me that wants to bring him back and just kind of do what we did last year and try to nurse him through the season. He's just such a good bat against right-handed pitching. And you can see he's been pretty productive these last 3 years in the majors with 24, 29, and 28 home runs, particularly given that 2 of those years he had 280 and 360 at-bats. His batting ratings don't suggest that he's really all that special, but you look at what he's done at the major league level, putting up a 120 OPS plus, 122 WRC plus over the course of his career. And he's been a pretty productive bat. His worst year, he had 24 home runs, although that was honestly his most productive, or his second most productive behind this past season in terms of his OPS plus and his WRC plus. Certainly his worst year would be the year that he hit 217 and 29 homers and 558 at-bats. But if we don't have to play him every day, there's part of me that wants the cash and the middle reliever, but particularly since we are moving on from Henry Gonzalez, I feel like we could piece together a season of Nakahara, especially at DH, or not even a full season, 100, 120 games maybe, if we're lucky, having that left-handed bat against right-handed pitching. Keep him on a real short leash as far as his rest. Try not to play him out in the outfield all that often. The bat is not bad for $6 million. And I just don't think we're going to find a better bat than that on the free agent market for the type of money that we're looking for. So I think I'm pivoting a little bit, and I think we're going to try to make an offer to Nakahara to come back for 1 year. We'll go for $6.2 million. Wants a no-trade clause. $6.25 million and a no-trade clause. We're not going to give you a no-trade clause, although no one's really going to want you. Fine, include a no-trade clause. $6.3 million. He's willing to think about it. All right, so this is a bit of a pivot for us to potentially bring back Nakahara. But we're not in as bad a situation financially as we normally are at this point, given that we're going to be moving on from Longoria and Gonzalez. And we've also gotten another $10 million boost in our budget. And we've moved on from other big contracts in recent years. It would basically mean that our roster is almost completely done at this point, and we really don't need to do anything in the off season, but that's fine. If we're basically losing Guzman and Gonzalez from the second best offense in the National League, we should be able to score a lot of runs again next year. Would love to hear what you think about this down below. He's either going to way outperform, $6.25 million if he's healthy, or he's going to way underperform it if he plays 47 games and has 2 or 3 stints on the IL. But he's been a pretty productive major league hitter over the course of his career, and he was extremely productive this past season with Pittsburgh. So as a hopefully guy that we'd like to get 100-plus games out of, he seems like a guy who could hit 25 home runs and 350, 400 at-bats for us in 100 games if he can stay healthy, which does have some value. And I think we're going to make an offer in arbitration to Mike Wright. Should be able to get him for about $7 million a year. He's a useful left-handed arm. He's honestly been more than useful since he's been with Pittsburgh. We've had him for 4 years. He's put up a 3.38 ERA with 520 strikeouts and 428 and 2/3 innings pitched. 2.43 Sierra, 125 ERA plus, 70 FIP minus. He's better against lefties than he is against righties. $7 million is a lot for him, but I'd rather have the bird in hand as far as a left-handed arm out of our bullpen, and he is a guy who could also start for us in a pinch. It's definitely too expensive. But we're still trying to compete and win it all next year. I am going to move on from Mingo. This is a guy who we had spend all of last year in AAA. He was back in the majors this year and was productive again. Love the high movement. Love that he's an extreme ground ball pitcher who throws in the mid to high 90s. Good personality, but he's going to also be looking for more than $7 million, and he's been a good arm for us. 3.32 ERA over 265 and 2/3 innings over the 3 years that he's been with us. He's definitely been a productive pitcher. But he's a right-handed arm rather than a lefty. He's going to probably cost about $300,000, $400,000 a year more than Wright did. And he's closer to just being a guy, in my opinion. So we may see what we can get for him in trade, although we've already done all of our shopping at this point, so probably time to move on to tomorrow. But I'm a little less certain that I want to make an offer to Mingo than I am to Wright. Not that personality matters. Wright's very popular, so that'll help a little bit. Mingo also very popular, so no real difference there. It's kind of interesting because did the same shot player on Mingo that I had done with Wright earlier, and as well also actually Gonzalez and Nakahara looking for pitchers. And Mingo, only one player offered, Tony Vega, reliever, making $14 million. So that does tell me that Mingo may not have the value that he thinks he does. I would consider bringing him back as a free agent next year, but we're going to go ahead and zero out that offer to him and let Mingo become a free agent, since there's just not a lot of trade value in him. See what he's worth on the open market. I mean, maybe there's an argument to do the same thing with Mike Wright, too. Would be a bold move. I just don't know how much demand there's going to be for him. Should we? Although if we take that offer back now, will he then not want to sign with us? Interesting decisions. Since we've made the offer to Wright, and there was actually some value for him on the trade market, tend to think we'll let that go through. But Mingo will be a good test. A guy who seems fully priced. As I mentioned, his arbitration number expected to be around 7.7 million, so we could sign him probably for 7.3, 7.4, most likely. Be interesting to see what he ends up attracting on the open market. If someone had made a decent trade offer for us, maybe we trade him away, but at this point, at least it's a interesting learning experience to see what a player like him could be worth on the open market. And Nakahara did end up agreeing to that extension with us. Fans excited by that. Sal Valadez also back. I can see we're signing a bunch of minor league free agents as well, which is somewhat less exciting. Danny Robles, Juan Bin Daoud back, which the fans seem to like. Arturo Arellano will be back. Mike Wright did sign the extension. Sean Street, that's an important one. So taking a look at, and then Mike Ceballos was the IL reliever of the year. He's a guy who could be a contributor for us at the back end of the rotation next season. So pretty good start here. Fan interest up to 100, as good as we've ever been, with the re-signing most of the arbitration eligible players, just waiting to hear about Alex Ruacho at this point, and then we're going to move on from Mingo and Quiroz at this point. Taking a look at the front office, we do have a little bit of money to potentially spend in the off season, which is positive, and we haven't had to tinker with scouting and development either. Player development, our minor league system is down to 26th. Obviously, we talked about some of the top young players that we had at the start of the episode, with guys who were big-time prospects like Alex Arroyo, Devin Smith, and then in the lineup, even the likes of Julio Castillo this year. But those guys are all kind of established-ish major leaguers at this point, and you can see that the fact that we've been picking in the mid to late 20s for most of the past decade, and we've also traded away some talent to try to remain competitive at the major league level, had a little bit of a toll on us. Nobody among our top prospects is imminent help. Top prospect in AAA is Jaden Godfrey, who is a guy who could help us as a utility infielder / outfielder next year. Hit 290 with 42 doubles and 18 triples in AAA last year. Has good speed, good bunter, good personality. Certainly a guy who would be on the mix as a fifth outfielder / backup utility guy, kind of more broadly even in the infield. But he's certainly not a difference-making offensive player, and he's kind of the most major league ready of any of the prospects we've got in our system at this point. And Alex Ruacho back as well. So we've done our work in arbitration at this point. Just Mingo and Quiroz, who we're moving on from. Made our qualifying offer to Longoria, and also going to be moving on from Gonzalez, Guzman, Calderon, and Dixon. So our heavy lifting for these early days of the offseason is done. I'm going to take a look at the award winners over the next week or two, and then sim up to the start of free agency. And I think that'll be it for this episode. And Joel Fields, who we talked about a little earlier, was the IL Player of the Year this past year. Again, nothing left for him to prove back down there after hitting 346 with 28 home runs and 350 at-bats. Hopefully he can be more productive at the major league level, though. It was parts of 3 seasons now. He's hit 230 with 12 homers and 440 at-bats. Clearly something between what he's currently done at the major league level in Pittsburgh and where he is in AAA is probably a reasonable expectation. So hopefully he can be a little more productive at the major league level for us this coming year, since he definitely has the opportunity for playing time with the fact that we moved on from Henry Gonzalez. And Greg Gaylord did end up winning Reliever of the Year for the second time in his career, even though we moved him out of the closer role, which particularly hurt us in the playoffs. But Gaylord with a second NL Reliever of the Year award, and he's also a 2-time All-Star at this point. 6-2, 26 saves, and that 149 ERA over 72 and 2/3 innings. His profile does not look all that intimidating. But the 32-year-old at this point, who we picked up in a trade with Tampa 7 years ago, has put up a 286 ERA over 531 innings since he came to Pittsburgh. Once we started using him more regularly out of the bullpen, he's been a much more productive player than the early stages of his career when Tampa was trying to make him a starter. And honestly, we started him 17 times in 2042, but he's had some really outstanding years for us pitching out of the bullpen, and now has a second NL Reliever of the Year award. And another day, another award. Julio Castillo, as we talked about earlier, thought he had a chance at Rookie of the Year for the number 21 prospect in baseball. And he did earn National League Rookie of the Year, 261, 28 home runs, 119 runs driven in, and 601 at-bats for the second baseman. So he is already a fan favorite and a pretty valuable and versatile defensive player who's got a pretty nice bat also. So really happy to see that international free agent signing from 6 years ago pan out for the Pirates. And Jan Vasquez, Manager of the Year this year, a guy that we promoted through our organization, brought him on our second year. So he has been a playoff manager for us 8 out of 9 years at this point, and finally won a Manager of the Year award in 2047, helping deliver the Pirates to the best record in baseball and their first World Series appearance under our reign. And although we did have a Manager of the Year, a Rookie of the Year, and a Reliever of the Year this year for the Pirates, did not win any of the big awards. Familiar trend in the AL Cy Young Award, Rogelio Loera, the insane pitcher for the Yankees, wins another Cy Young Award after going 16-4 with 252 strikeouts and a 291 ERA and 160 and 2/3 innings. On the National League side, Ivan Parks of the Brewers, 22-6. That's a lot of wins for 2047 baseball. 3.14 ERA, wins the Cy Young Award for the Brewers. You can see Sean Street got a couple of votes for the Pirates. Kansas City's Juan Rivas wins a very, very difficult AL MVP award over Angel Aguilar, former Pirates farmhand. Oliver Garza and Josh Hurd, 4 different players receiving first place votes there in the American League. And in the National League, Raul Sanchez from the Brewers outpolls his teammate Rich Gilbo. Gilbo, 336, 26, and 73. Raul Sanchez, the left fielder, 296, 50 homers, 132 runs driven in. Lupe Zelaya in his first year with Pittsburgh got some votes. as did our center fielder Arellano. Both of those guys will be back next year. And Nakahara also got some MVP votes, and he will be back with us next year as well. Check in on our buddy Isaiah Hill, and assuming he's still with the Dodgers, doesn't look like he got any votes. Check in on see how Mr. Hill has done since we moved on from that big contract. Second year with the Dodgers this year, after leading the league with 47 homers, 31 homers, 111 ribbies, 274 batting average. So still a very productive offensive player. But he has put up the two weakest seasons of his career in terms of his OPS plus the last 2 years since we moved on from him, making $32 million this year. And he's going to be 36 this upcoming season, and then a player option for 40. So just a guy that we couldn't afford, but nice to see that he is still continuing on his Hall of Fame track with his career. So we're through the awards now, just waiting to get to free agency at this point. We're not waiting to hear on any other arbitration-eligible players. We know we'll be losing some big free agents. Presumably Longoria will not entertain our qualifying offer. If we had him back at around $19 million, wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing in the world for 1 year, not having to make a long-term commitment, but hard to imagine that he would agree to that. And in unsurprising news, Longoria did file for free agency, so he is very unlikely to be back at this point. Move on to the free agency filings and see exactly what the opportunity set potentially looks for us here in the open market as free agency is going to be beginning. Quick look at the international free agents. Whoa, Manny Renteria out of Cuba looks like a very interesting prospect, young and high potential according to our scouts. Left-handed pitcher too, with he's potentially a guy that we would want to think about. We don't have great accuracy on him, but certainly a 22-year-old lefty who throws in the mid to high 90s, good personality. Could be an interesting arm for us out of the bullpen. So we'll take a look at him. The big free agents, not surprising to see names like Longoria and Calderon, both off of our team, on the free agent market at this point. And not really a ton of big-time everyday players. Mike Augustini's still out there. Kind of odd at this point. Guy who was a multiple MVP, perennial all-star, who the last several years has been bouncing back and forth between AAA and the majors. He's wrecked physically, but looks like he wants to continue making some big money, so can't begrudge him that. And among the pitchers, as we had talked about, top lefties, Calderon and Bobby Gonzalez off of our team. Sean Chandler, 23-year-old who's out with shoulder inflammation, is a free agent lefty. That's interesting. Just got horrible control and really mediocre movement, but he's a popular guy. He's a lefty, throws hard, has 3 great pitches, not looking for a ton of money. He's going to walk a ton of batters and probably give up a decent amount of home runs, but certainly not typically the type of player that you'd see on the free agent market. Ethan Mingo, it was a good decision. We didn't give him the $7.5 million he was looking for. Looks like he's only looking for $3.4 million on the open market. So he's a guy who, if he wants to talk to us after we didn't make him an arbitration offer, we could certainly think about potentially bringing back. And then there was that other left-hander, not Victor Rojas. He's making a ton of Latrell Young, and he is on the market too as a lefty, the 31-year-old. So some interesting guys out there to potentially supplement our pitching staff. We're in a decent situation. We've got some money for free agents right now. I don't know that there's a difference maker who's available for 20-25 million dollars. I tend to think there probably isn't. Certainly could make a play at one of the big pitchers on the market, but not surprisingly, the top starters, Longoria and Machuca, both looking for over $30 million a year. So they are out of our price range. Danny Carrio, probably out of our price range also. But we'll, Luis Flores, first baseman, our old first baseman available. What's he done since he moved on from us? 76 games last year with the Phillies, 240 batting average, 3 home runs. So not all that productive for the 28-year-old who's wrecked physically. So we've got money to spend, which is the good news. I don't think there's a ton of difference makers out there. We will be able to also look on the trade market. As I talked about, our minor league team or minor league system does not have the top end talent that it used to at this point. So going to be a little more difficult for us to pull off a big trade than it has been in the past, perhaps. But going to be an interesting offseason. Definitely have taken some hits on the pitching staff, moving on from Longoria, the most obvious hit, as well as potentially Mingo, and then moving on from Guzman and Gonzalez in terms of our everyday lineup. We are not as good a team as we were at the end of the regular season. But as I said, we've got some money to potentially spend. We've got great fan interest right now. We're not in a bad spot, so it's going to be an interesting off season to see if we can retool these Pirates and remain in competition to hopefully eventually get that World Series title that we've been chasing for a decade now here in Pittsburgh. And we'll find out what kind of progress we can make in the free agent and trade markets this offseason in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching and hope you have a great day.